to add a little bit of that education and awareness about the service and what it essentially has to deliver across its communities. So I'm going to share my screen, and while I'm doing that, if I just make a comment specifically in relation to the previous questions before we started the item. We were requested by the chair of the Fire Authority to undertake quite a comprehensive engagement programme and include a briefing to all of the local authorities. So my PA did send out a request to each local authority to include ourselves on a future meeting. Sheffield is our final local authority that we are with tonight. We've briefed the other three local authorities in South Yorkshire on this exact same presentation that we'll be delivering to yourselves tonight. And we've captured feedback from all of those sessions. None of which I have to say has required us to make significant changes to the document itself, but really valuable for us to take feedback and feed it into our future planning and to consider all feedback. So just to give you some assurances, yes, we will consider any feedback that we receive tonight. Challenging if it's going to require us to make significant changes to the document. But if I can just also provide some assurance that when we sent out the request to each local authority, we also sent a link and a version of the draft document. That was back in September when we initially presented the draft document to our fire authority, who then requested that we went out and did some more formal consultation, both internally and externally, on its content. So the document's been out there from our perspective since September the 14th, when it was originally approved as a draft by the Fire and Rescue Authority. And we've reshaped it based on the feedback that we've had throughout that consultation period. So we've had 12 weeks since the initial draft was presented to the Fire Authority until Friday last week, the 4th of December, at which point the formal consultation period closed. But we're happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity, like I've said, to present this to yourselves. Just to check that you can all see the screen that I am currently showing, that should have a slideshow on it. I can see some people nodding. So what I'll intend to do is probably take about 30 minutes of your time to go through this presentation. Sometimes it takes a bit longer if there are members who want to jump in at any point. Just bear in mind, if you are on mute and you're trying to speak, I won't be able to hear you. So make yourself heard if you want to do, and I'll try and answer questions as we go along. But then sometimes we've had members who've just waited until the presentation's finished, and then we can capture all the questions at the end. So I'm happy either way, but I'll just start making progress through the presentation. So one of the things that fire and rescue services have to do is understand and manage risk. It's really crucial in achieving our overall aim. So as a service, we have our aims in the speech brackets there. And effectively, we deliver our aim through our integrated risk management plan. And I'll use the acronym. We love acronyms in the fire service. I'll use the acronym IRMP for the integrated risk management plan as we progress through the presentation. We've got some legal requirements within the Fire and Rescue Service, as many public services do. Within the Fire and Rescue Services Act that was introduced in 2004, which is the main bedrock legislation that fire and rescue services have to adhere to, there's a specific section within there that refers to something that is called the Fire and Rescue Service National Framework. And the National Framework document is revised regularly. The last iteration was in 2018, and effectively it sets out the priorities and objectives of each English fire service. And these include having an assessment of foreseeable risks across the local areas that you serve. And then you've got to have a proportionate allocation of resources in relation to your service delivery activities. And I capture service delivery activities within both prevention, protection, and response activities. And to simplify the prevention and protection elements, if you consider prevention to be all things in terms of preventing emergencies happening within the home and whilst people are at leisure, and protection activities specifically related to our work with business within the business environment. So it's more around commercial properties and their adherence to relevant fire safety legislation to protect themselves and their staff, or any members of the public or people that use their buildings. And obviously that final element, which is the one that we are so well known for, is response. So that's the big red fire engines turning out with blue lights. That's the emergency response element of what we do. To summarise those key responsibilities that are captured within the Fire and Rescue Services Act, there's a specific section that talks about our duties in terms of firefighting. Clearly, we've always had that duty. Road traffic collisions, which interestingly wasn't a statutory requirement for Fire and Rescue Services until the 2004 Act was introduced. However, many years before that, we were responding to road traffic collisions. We called them RTAs at that point, road traffic accidents, but they're now road traffic collisions, because we have staff who are capable to use specific equipment to rescue people who might be trapped following those incidents. But it only became a legal requirement of ours in 2004. We also have to provide fire safety as a legal requirement, and that is promoting fire safety, including how to prevent fires occurring in the first place and how to educate people around means of escape from buildings if there is a fire. And that's not only people in their home, it's also providing advice to responsible people and managers within a business environment as well. We also attend many other civil emergencies. Notably, you'll remember the significant flooding that's impacted South Yorkshire in 2007 and more recently in November last year. And we have to have a capability to attend a whole range of civil emergencies with the new dimensions threats that were emerging following notable incidents such as the Twin Towers attack in New York in 2001, the July London bombings, and these events obviously make the government consider which agencies have got the capabilities to respond to these type of emergencies. And the Fire and Rescue Service are one of the key emergency responders to many civil emergencies, albeit we don't have legal requirements specifically in England to attend and respond to flooding incidents. And that may come as a surprise to you, but it is true. In Scotland, Wales and Ireland, they do have legal requirements to attend flooding from Fire and Rescue Services. But in England, we still do not have a legal requirement to attend and respond to flooding incidents, but we have staff, we have vehicles and a capability to do it. So of course, as a blue light services, we are involved in that flooding, and notably we're involved in that flooding last year to the point where we've recently won national and global awards for our ability to operate in a resilient way through the floods last year. The other thing that we attend is down at the bottom here, special service calls. And this is a range of incidents that we are asked to attend that might be rescuing people from water, people that are trapped at height, and other situations where people might be in need of assistance. We might call that humanitarian assistance. We might be required to attend that on behalf of other agencies. So for example, ambulance services who might be struggling to gain access to a property where they think somebody might be inside in need of their support. They often call on the support from Fire and Rescue Services to gain access to property. So that would classify as a special service call. Another example might be if you own a large chemical distribution plant and you have a chemical spillage and you need the fire service to come and support with that emergency, that would classify as a special service call as well. Some of those special service calls, if they are humanitarian, we do for free. Others, we might look to recover some of our costs and charge for those services. So I mentioned one of the critical elements of the integrated risk management process is risk modelling. So that allows us to profile risk across the county of South Yorkshire. And we do that tapping into a variety of data sets that we've got available to us, both internal data sets and external data sets. We can blend those data sets and overlay them with one another, or we can separate them out and see what they inform us about risk. And it allows us to determine how we then allocate our resources to deliver both our prevention protection activity, but it also allows us to determine how best to deliver our resources in relation to the way that we respond to fires. And that's notably about where we would locate fire stations, what staffing models we used across those fire stations to best address the risks that we've identified. So the data sets that we can use include some of the things that are captured in the smaller bullet list here, which is previous incident trends, and we can look at all of our incident occurrences over a 12-month period, over a 3-year period, to look at whether or not there's any specific trends emerging. And you can filter for different incident types. So I could ask our data team internally to tell me where we've had road traffic collisions across areas of Sheffield in the last 3 years to look at whether or not we've got trends emerging. And then that can inform our education activity, working with partners to try and reduce the number of road traffic collisions. And that does happen. We can also look at accidental dwelling fires to see whether or not we've got specific trends in where they occur. We can look at certain other types of incidents, such as what we classify as a nuisance type fire, and that might be small, deliberately set fires. Where do they occur during school holidays? And then we can work within schools in the areas where we experience high levels of what I classify as nuisance fires, to try to reduce that type of incident occurring. And that all informs not only our response activity, but it also massively informed our prevention activity as well. We also look at something called IMD. Members may be aware of the indices of multiple deprivation. The last data set for IMD nationally was run in 2019, looking at a variety of things that would make somebody more deprived. And that can be broken down geographically to not only ward level, which you'll be all familiar with, but we can look at an even smaller geographical area, which we indeed do, which is down to lower super output area level. Mosaic is something else that we can use, another external data set that's normally used for supporting marketing campaigns. It considers people's shopping style, people's general lifestyle and behavior characteristics. But the way fire and rescue services can tap into that data is to, again, inform our ability to best target our prevention messages. So to give you an example of that, if we know certain characteristics of lifestyle would indicate unsafe cooking practices, we know that a third of our accidental dwelling fires are in relation to cooking related fires. So if we can target our messages around safer cooking, specifically to individuals that through Mosaic might be a higher risk level from cooking related fires, then again, it just allows us that opportunity to use data and intelligence to better target our resources to where they are needed most. Exeter is an NHS data set, specifically in relation to people who are registered with a GP, who are over the age of 65. And again, we can use this type of data set because we know that there is correlation between people as they get older in life and their vulnerability to fire if they were to have one. People who are younger tend to be able to escape from fire quicker. I'm generalizing there. I know that there are a lot of people over the age of 65 that are more than capable of escaping their property, but we have to look at the sheer facts that the statistics do demonstrate that there is an increased level of vulnerability as one gets older in life. And if we, for example, were to overlay the information from Exeter showing us where people live who are over the age of 65 with local authority data, which would indicate perhaps where people are living alone, that even more refines our ability to target people who are more vulnerable, because as you get older and live alone, that does significantly increase your risk from fire. And again, we can use those data sets to really target our activity. So we do a lot of work around risk modelling within South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Services, and many services nationally becoming a lot more tuned into the data sets that are available. What that looks like in terms of maps across the county is these are the incident trends that I talked about previously. If you look at physical, the actual physical dots on a map where we attended emergencies, then the top right chart here on this slide shows each of the emergency incidents attended by South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue in a 3-year time period, and you can see where there are clusters. Obviously, in the more remote rural areas, we experience much fewer emergency incidents compared to the more built-up areas around the city and town centres. When you look at that generally on a heat map, which is the bottom left chart, that is all of the same information, but it's just generated as a heat map as opposed to a cluster map. And again, if you look at where our activity is occurring from a prevention perspective, it should in theory follow where the heat is where the heat map is from a response perspective. So where our incidents occur generally is where we do a lot of our activity. But what we have to consider is that there are on occasion incidents that occur in the more rural areas that are perhaps further away from where our fire stations are located. because traditionally we've not had many emergency incidents there, doesn't mean that there are not people living in those areas who are themselves quite high risk and vulnerable, but they are living within a low risk area. And we have to really lean on the work across our partnerships to identify those individuals, because we want to both target our work from a prevention perspective to where we experience the most types of emergencies, but we also want to identify individuals, who are themselves relatively high risk, but living within a generally low risk area. And we do that work much through our partnership working, which has grown from strength to strength over the years. When we look at the indices of multiple deprivation down to a lower super output area level, the data set shows this type of information. And again, it quite correlates. If you look at that compared to the previous map, which shows where the incidents occur, you can see some correlation between areas of high deprivation and where our incidents are occurring, specifically in and around Sheffield. So where we have relatively low risk deprivation levels on the, going out towards Derbyshire, etc., is where we're going to have relatively low incident rates. So there is a correlation and a significantly close correlation between indices of multiple deprivation and where we experience emergency incidents. And we use that information to massively inform where we locate our fire engines. So the little black dots here on the map are the locations of our fire engines to best address the risk that we've identified with the available resources that were allocated through the government funds and our local authority precept collection. What all of that data analysis and understanding of risk should do is inform our prevention strategy. And I mentioned before, if you consider prevention being everything that we do to reduce emergencies happening in the home and whilst people are at leisure. So that's home fire safety, road safety, water safety, and a number of other campaigns that we do to try and reduce people's risk. We do want to prevent emergencies happening in the first place. That mantra from a fire and rescue service perspective changed not long after I joined the service some 22 years ago. We used to be purely around response. Perversely, fire and rescue services used to be funded based on the number of emergency incidents that they attended in any one year. So that never really gave many fire and rescue service chiefs the motivation to do much prevention activity and reduce emergencies happening in the first place. But come 2004, when the Act changed and prevention and fire safety became a legal requirement, the amount of effort and energy that went into preventing emergencies happening in the first place from a fire perspective massively increased. And we now have dedicated teams to prevent emergencies happening, but we also have our operational fire crews that support in a lot of delivery of prevention activity through the various activities that are listed in the smaller bullet list here, which is the Home Safety Visit Programme, which is our flagship programme for stopping emergencies in the home, where we give all sorts of advice and education around how to prevent fires occurring, from safer cooking practices, safer smoking, electrical safety, how to plan an escape route, etc., etc. And whilst we are there, if the occupant qualifies and requires it, we will fit free smoke alarms in all relevant rooms that apply. We also work with specific community groups who we feel are vulnerable, and that ranges from children and young people through our dedicated programs of Prince's Trust. We work on dedicated programs across ourselves and the police, a centre in Rotherham, where we try to get all Year 6 pupils across South Yorkshire to be educated on a number of areas, not just fire safety and road safety and water safety, but they get information on avoiding gangs and drugs and crime, and general information about how to integrate into society and community cohesion. So we do lots of work with children and young people, but we also target specific community groups through safety campaigns. And I've mentioned earlier around the work that we do: water safety, road safety, cooking safety, etc., etc. We'll certainly probably be doing something on electrical safety around Christmas tree lights in the run up to Christmas. And again, with the data sets that we have available, it does become much more targeted to those that we feel are more at risk and vulnerable. We also heavily rely on referrals from our partners across local authorities, working in adult social care, working with children and young people, police, ambulance services, community practitioners such as community nursing teams, because if they've been educated by ourselves about how to do some basic analysis of fire risk in somebody's home, then they can be our eyes and ears for that initial assessment of risk, and then they've got a very simple referral process into us, which means that we can then follow that up and go out and visit people and provide them with the education, with the information and with the interventions that we can provide to reduce the risk specifically from fire. If you look at the impact on accidental dwelling fires of all of that work, the yellow line here starts off back in 2001-2 on the left, where we were experiencing just over 1,000 accidental dwelling fires across the county per year. That has reduced to more recent times on the right-hand side to under 500 accidental dwelling fires. That's over 50% reduction in 20 years in the number of accidental dwelling fires experienced across the county. And if you look at the black line, that is the number of homes that we've visited cumulatively to give our education advice, fit free smoke alarms, so that the number of fires that we do experience now, it's much more likely that when our firefighters arrive at the scene, the family or occupants of that house fire are stood waiting for them on the driveway or the garden because the smoke alarm's given them due warning and allowed them to escape safely. Whereas in previous times, certainly overnight when people were in bed, no smoke alarms and a fire developing downstairs was a recipe for disaster, because as you well know through the education campaigns, smoke is the thing that kills people when they're asleep in their beds. And I've been to many incidents in my career, too many to count, where that's been the case. But the education and advice that we give and the installation of smoke alarms has given that statistic, which is that yellow line, which I think is testament to the amount of work that's been delivered across the county to reduce that risk. And we couple that with other elements of changes in legislation around foam-filled furniture regulations and general safer cooking practices. Less people own chip pans now. And a lot of people who smoke tend to smoke on the back doorstep as opposed to smoking inside the house. These were all things that accumulated risk across the county of South Yorkshire, and it's really pleasing to see that yellow line dropping, and long may it continue to do so. If I move on now to what our protection strategy is reflected within the Integrated Risk Management Plan. So this is how we deploy our staff to support businesses and workplaces. Now, a lot of people think it's the fire service's responsibility to do all things fire safety within businesses, and it is not the case. The fire service has a specific responsibility under a piece of legislation called the Regulatory Reform Order that was introduced in 2005. And what that document did is it amalgamated some 100 pieces of legislation across fire safety, and it brought them under one banner. And that banner, the Regulatory Reform Order, gives a specific requirement. Excuse me, my lights have gone off. That's cost saving measures for you, Stuart. You don't move enough and the lights go off around here. So apologies for that. Hopefully you can see me again. So that legislation gives a specific responsibility to the owner or manager of the premises that we're dealing with here that fall underneath that legislation. And it is the owner's responsibility to conduct a risk assessment from a fire safety perspective and consider any member of the public or any member of staff that use that building and consider the means of escape and any requirements that they need within the building to support fire safety measures. What the fire service has to do is it has to respond to complaints. It has to go and check compliance with the business premises, that the responsible owner is aware of their requirements under that legislation. And then the other thing that it would do is if it felt as a service that a business was not safe from a fire safety perspective, it has specific powers to issue improvement notices. Enforcement action can be taken by the Fire and Rescue Service, all the way up to taking owners and managers to court and going through litigation measures where we can effectively prosecute people against that piece of legislation. As a service, we have always been strong advocate of sprinklers. The fact remains that there's not been one fire fatality in a building where sprinklers have been installed. And I have to say, coming into South Yorkshire and reading the information around how many buildings have been retrofitted with sprinklers, specifically within Sheffield, hats off to you as members that have advocated that work as well, because there have been lots of retrofitting of sprinklers within Sheffield. And I commend anybody that's been involved in that work. I think it's fantastic that many of the high-rise residential buildings that are local authority owned within Sheffield have been retrofitted. And specifically in relation to the cladding issue and Grenfell, a lot of that dangerous cladding has now been removed, and that's I think that's fantastic work across the district that people should be rightly proud of. Still more work to go. Our response strategy, this is where the fire engines and the officers turn out with the blue lights and do all the stuff that a lot of firefighters say they joined the job for. In reality, that takes up around 6 to 10% of a firefighter's time when they are at work. The rest of their time is spent doing all of the other stuff around trying to stop emergencies happening in the first place. And that's how it should be, really. But this determines how we then deploy firefighters, where we locate fire stations, what type of fire engines and appliances we need to have available to us, what capabilities that we need in terms of the risks that we've identified across the county. It also determines what staffing models we use across our fire stations. So you might be familiar that some of our fire stations are what we call whole time staffing model, where you've got firefighters available to immediately deploy to emergencies 24/7, 365 days a year. We have other fire stations that are staffed on what's called an on-call retained model. And that's where the firefighters who work at that local station have to live within 5 minutes or work within 5 minutes, and they effectively are alerted on a pager that they carry around with them all the time. And as long as they are available to be contacted on their alerter, they then have to get to the fire station, form a crew and turn out. So that obviously is a slightly slower response to a whole-time model. And you normally find that retained stations or on-call stations are located in more rural areas where the number of emergencies are much fewer compared to the likes of Central and Parkway that are around the more high-risk areas where we have whole-time models where firefighters are always at the station. When it comes to where our fire stations are and and specifically where our fire engines are, we term that fire cover. And if we've got a situation tonight where we have no emergency incidents occurring and all of our fire engines on all of our fire stations are all available and ready to go, our fire cover is as good as it can be with the resources that we've got available to us. But if you imagine that we had a significant emergency within one of our districts tonight, let's say there was a large fire in Barnsley, and 10 of our fire engines from across the fleet had to deploy to that emergency, then the remaining fire engines would perhaps have to relocate to ensure that we are effectively spreading our fielders, to use a cricket analogy, to then protect the rest of the county. And that's called fire cover. That is managed very dynamically by our colleagues in our fire control centre, who will very quickly start to relocate fire stations or fire engines across the county to make sure that those that we've got available are providing as much fire cover as we can possibly provide with the resources that we've got available. But indeed, we might get to a point where we have deployed that many fire engines to one incident that we need to bring more fire engines on the run. And we've got the availability to do that through what is and I'll talk about that in the next slide, which is our resilience strategy. So one of the critical elements of this year's RMP is the plan to introduce a set of risk-based response times based specifically on two factors: the level of risk within the community that we've identified through our understanding of that data set that we've considered, and the severity of the incident that we attend. So I've already talked about risks within the county, and we can identify risks based on indices of multiple deprivation and where we are likely to experience emergencies. And we can classify those geographical areas as high risk. So they are more, they're likely to be where you've got high levels of deprivation and we experience lots of emergencies. The medium risks are obviously where we have, an average amount and the deprivation levels are perhaps in that medium band. And then the low risk areas geographically are more in the rural areas where we don't tend to experience emergency incidents and the deprivation levels tend to be much lower. The second element that we consider is the severity of the incident. So if you were on a fire engine tonight and you got turned out to an emergency, and that emergency involved a small fire in a field, nowhere near any building or property, and the person that phoned in the fire said, I'm stood near it, there's nobody, there's no life involved, there's nobody's at risk, I would classify that as a relatively low risk incident, and I'm sure you'd agree. If you compare that incident to a house fire where you've got mum and two babies trapped upstairs in a bedroom, unable to escape because the fire's got out of the living room and is starting to progress up the stairs, that is a high risk incident. So we have a range of severity in terms of the emergencies that we attend. And we've got to consider both the severity of the incident and the geographical risk where the incident occurs when we start to consider how to introduce a proportionate risk-based attendance time for the whole county. So when I talk about that response time, you've got to consider it's made up of three sections. The first element is when our control centre, we have a dedicated control centre, 999 centre, if you like, a 999 call handling centre within South Yorkshire Fire. What happens when you dial 999 is you initially go through to a BT switch, and they will ask you which emergency service you wish to be put through to. When you say fire, they will already know your geographical location based on your landline number, which you're calling on, or the mobile mast that pings the signal off the mobile phone that you're using. And that phone line will then, that call will then drop into the respective 999 fire control centre. So you'll come into this section here. The time it takes for our call handlers in our 999 control room to determine the location of the incident from the caller and what type of incident it is, usually takes between 1 and 2 minutes to get that information from the caller. Often people are panicked. They sometimes don't know the address, especially if they're dealing with a road traffic collision or they're not familiar with the area. So we have to work with the individual to, number one, try and calm them down, get them to explain what the emergency is, to let our control operators know where the location is, and then they will mobilize obviously the nearest fire engine, or if we need more resources, the nearest resources to that incident. Once they've done that, the local, as you'll be familiar with the term, the bells go down. So this is this point here, the bells go down on the local station, and the fire crew will then start going to the fire engine. That is the turnout time. So from the time the bells go down to the time the fire engine wheels are turning is this time here. That's the turnout time. And then the final element is the travel time. Critically, these two elements, turnout and travel time, is the most essential when we determine the location of where our fire stations are and the staffing models that we employ on those fire stations. So it's really important that these two elements of time are considered within our response times. We will always monitor this time, the call handling element of it, but it's relatively static. Obviously, depending on where the incident is, if you consider a fire next door to where the fire station is located, it's not going to take very long to get there. If it's further away, then obviously it's going to take a little bit longer. So you've got to consider that this can flex, whereas this one's fairly static. So we use these two to determine where we locate fire stations and the shift models that we employ. One of the things that we committed to in our previous RMPs that we are still committed to is this objective. We'll always aim to get to every emergency as fast as we can. But we were criticised in an inspection last year because we didn't have any dedicated response times. This was the only commitment that we had. And effectively, as a senior officer in South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, I'm not particularly comfortable with only having this as our commitment, because we can get to any emergency as fast as we can. Even if we had one fire engine covering the whole county, we could still aim to achieve this commitment. But having a set of response times ensures that the existing resources that we've got, as long as we can maintain what those response times are within a reasonable amount of times, it gives an element of protection over our existing resources, in my view. So these are the response times that we're looking to introduce. So left-hand side is the community risk category. I've talked about the levels of deprivation and the types of incident and the number of emergencies that we've experienced previously that determine whether or not we're in a high, medium or low risk category. And then these are the types of incidents that we attend. So this is the house fire persons reported. This is the small fire, nuisance fire in the middle of a park where it's not risking life or property. And as you progress down through each one, we add 2 minutes, because we know full well that previous analysis indicates that these response times are about appropriate for where our resources are currently located to respond to incidents across the county of South Yorkshire. This is all included within our integrated risk management plan as a draft proposal. The final element of all of our strategies is resilience. So there's a piece of legislation here that requires fire services to have business continuity management arrangements in place. That's never been tested as much as it has in 2020 for obvious reasons. But we actively work alongside our partners in the local resilience forum. But not only that, we have arrangements in place through legislation with neighbouring fire and rescue services to provide us with resources if we really need them. So I mentioned earlier that 10 pump job that we got at Barnsley. If all of a sudden we needed 20 fire engines, that would significantly deplete South Yorkshire's resources, and we would be putting a call into our neighbouring fire and rescue services to provide us with support, and they would give us that support. We can also ask nationally for support through a national arrangement where all fire services have agreed that they will share not only national resilience assets that are on a national resilience register that we host, within South Yorkshire, but we'll also share fire engines and firefighters if the need arises. And we put that to the test when we had the significant moorland fire at Hatfield in Doncaster in summer, where we were dealing with that for a number of weeks. And there were firefighters from as far away as Suffolk and Northumberland supporting South Yorkshire dealing with that fire. And it's not uncommon now for fire and rescue services to share resources to make sure that they are resilient. In terms of local resilience, we can always ask volunteers who are not on duty to come back and staff fire appliances, and we pay them an additional remuneration rate for any recall to duty. And we've got people who are willing to offer their out of office or out of work phone numbers in case they could be contacted to come back to do additional shifts. And we've exercised that, and it allows us an element of resilience as well for firefighters, officers, control room staff, and indeed many of our support services. Stuart manages a large team, and many of Stuart's team went over and above through Hatfield Moor fires, delivering logistical support to incidents. So it's a real big team effort when we tap into that resilience arrangement. Councillor Dams mentioned before that we'd gone out and asked the public what they thought to our plans to not only introduce the response times, but we wanted to know what their views were of the service generally. So we went out and did a summer public consultation exercise prior to the draft being presented to the authority in September. 5,000 people engaged with that, and a further circa 1,000 people have engaged since we launched that formal consultation period on 14th of September. Overwhelming support for our work to inspect buildings and businesses to ensure they're compliant with relevant fire safety legislation. Again, overwhelming support with people strongly valuing in green our work to prevent emergencies happening in the first place. And of course, members of the public, over 90% strongly value the work that we do when we respond to emergencies. We asked some other questions about whether or not we should respond to incidents based on their severity, which really informs our response times that I've mentioned earlier. And over 90% of people responding to that survey either strongly agreed or agreed that we should respond to incidents based on severity. And that's not to say that we'll drive slower to that low risk incident, but when you ask officers in charge of fire engines, and if you ask drivers of fire engines, if they do respond differently when they know that someone's life is at risk, they will say yes, and they should say yes. We still drive to arrive, and we train our drivers extremely well in fire and rescue services to drive on blue lights to make progress. But we also have a policy where normally the firefighters would always get dressed before the fire engine turns a wheel. But I might allow an element of deviation from that if they know that there's a fire close by, and the firefighters can get dressed en route, accepting a small element of risk to be able to progress quicker if there is life in danger. So these are just some of the examples where we would respond slightly differently to a more serious incident. And the second question that we asked specifically in terms of response time is, do they agree that we respond differently to incidents based on where they are in terms of geographical risk? And again, we had an overwhelming response rate where more than 50% strongly agreed. And if you add that to those that agreed, it was well into the 84-85% territory. So again, a real strong advocacy from the public that we surveyed, that they felt fairly confident in the science behind our response time arrangements. So in terms of the next steps, clearly we were receiving feedback through the formal consultation period. We've made a few amendments to the draft document after we've considered all of that feedback that we've captured. And we will aim to present a final version back to our authority in January. But as you'll be familiar with in terms of the cycle of reporting structure within fire, be very similar in local authorities. We are almost at the cut-off date for our final document to be almost signed and sealed because of the cycle of meetings that it goes through before being presented to the Fire Authority on the 11th of January for their final decision. Just to give you confidence, we've worked extensively internally. 95% of the workforce now have received or had an opportunity to receive a presentation very similar to this, and then they've completed an internal survey to capture their views. You are the final of the local authorities that we've briefed. Local MPs have been briefed by myself and the Chief Fire Officer, and internally the Fire Brigades Union, the Fire Officers Association, and the support staff or predominant support staff representative bodies, Unison and Unite, have also had specific briefings from myself and other officers around the development of this year's plan, and we've considered all of their formal feedback within our consultation outcomes as well. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And looking at the time, I think it took perhaps slightly longer there, but hopefully that's been a good background and education in terms of the requirements for us to deliver the IRMP and the way that we've gone about it this year. And I will take questions at that point. Thank you.
Stuart or Councillor Dance, is there anything that you want to add before we move into questions, or are you just happy to?
I'm very happy, and just to say thank you to Chris for a comprehensive walk through a very important document. I'm sure if people think of questions after tonight, we can get them answered. There's some immediate questions, obviously, but if people go away and think about it and have other questions, we can get answers to them. So thanks, Chris, and thank you in anticipation to Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Downs.
I'm fine, Councillor Curran. I just like listening to Chris Kirby's voice.
Okay, so councillors, as usual in this environment, if you have a question, if you could let me know via the chat function, just because there's more faces than there is screen space, so I don't want to risk missing anybody. So if I'll start with Councillor McGowan. Do you want to go ahead first, please?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I thought the document that we received as well, it's very clear. Which in a way I was going to say it's a pleasure to read, but I meant it was easy reading. You know, sometimes you can get bogged down in detail and it gets a little bit, but I thought the information was really good. So thanks, and well done on the presentation as well. I work a lot with Burley. Well, I'm saying a lot. I have worked with Burley Fire Station and use their community rooms as well for meetings. On local issues where we've had fires in our green open spaces, children doing it, and then that's meant us going to the school, and we did a session every morning, so with the secondary school, and the police and the fire came along and spoke about that. So that was really good. So I really appreciate you engaging with us and doing that, and it was an outstanding, and I think even Anne was the Lord Mayor at the time, and you came and presented certificates to the kids. So it was the cadets, your cadets, that came and supported us on a litter pick as well afterwards, because it was litter bins that were wheelie bins that was getting taken into the wooded area and set on fire. So I think that's fantastic support that you give, and engagement, and the talk that we give to the kids. It was only 20 minutes in an assembly every morning, but we got to over 2,000 children doing that. So hopefully, and we've not had any issues since, so hopefully it worked. The one thing I wanted to address was something that I keep having an argument with my daughter over, is mobile phones and beds. And I've just seen on Facebook this last week a case where a young lady was in bed and fell asleep and had a phone on, and it started a fire. And I am constantly, it was something to do with the metal frame of a bed, Mum said, but they were showing the mattress and everything and where the fire had been. And I just wondered how much of an incident that is. I mean, she's 24, so she's not a child. Constantly having to go at my daughter for finding a mobile phone under a pillow and thinking about the heat and it's still being and it's charging up and everything. And that's the thing that really, really worries me. And I don't know how many fires and if that is something I'm overreacting to, or if it's some. I didn't find a mention of that. And I know you said you was going to talk to people about Christmas lights. I didn't know if this was something that young people ought to be talked to about, because she just sees it as me as nagging.
Yeah. No, nag away, Councillor McGowan. You need to nag at the kids. I do it myself. You're quite right. We do have a dedicated electrical safety week through the National Fire Chiefs Council that we tend to support. And we try to raise the profile of fires that have occurred through not only electrical, white goods has always been a bit of a concern. You know, there might be product recalls on white goods, and our fire investigation officers have got a wealth of information about the types of products that they often identify if it's an electrical related fire. It's rare that you can get mobile phones setting on fire, I have to say. So it is a rare occurrence to, I guess, allay some of your concerns. But where you've got certainly laptops that are being charged, there's a vent underneath laptops, and if you're just sitting on a bed or a couch and the laptop it's not on a firm surface, that can really start to overheat the battery units in laptops. We've had other notable campaigns around. If you remember, a few years ago, there was a real explosion in Christmas gifts and birthday gifts that were the electrical, what were they called? They basically stood on them, and they're like, I can't remember what they're called now, but there were things with large batteries in them. Hoverboards. Loads of kids wanted hoverboards, and there were some notable incidents because if the charging units are not compatible with the hoverboard, then the charging units can overheat. So all I'd recommend is, if you go online and look at the website, you'll get links to electrical safety information. We always advise when we're doing that kind of campaigning to make sure that you're using the charging device that came with the product that you're using, that you are using products that are kite marked and certified. That those are the kind of things. Don't leave things charging overnight out of sight, that kind of thing. But yeah, wherever they're charging mobile phones, I'd always advocate that they leave them on a firm surface. So if you've got a shelf or a set of drawers next to a bed, then it's better to be sat on there rather than on a bed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Dale.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks, Chris, for your presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our firefighters for continuing to respond to emergencies throughout the pandemic. I know it can't have been easy. I've been out on the front line. I'd also like to thank our local firefighters for working in partnership across the dark nights period within Shire Green, engaging with our young people, doing street-based work really, because a lot of our clubs were closed, so they went out with our youth workers and PCSOs on the streets to do some of that education around fireworks, which actually really worked in our area. So thank you for that. Please, excuse me if I've missed something here, and I think I've asked this question before in a previous scrutiny meeting. And you were talking about how you forward plan based on data, and data can be quite historic. I'm just wondering what thoughts have been taken into account about our change in landscape, particularly in city centres where we're building upwards. We're bringing people to live in the city centres, so we've got more accommodation, student accommodation, and I'm just wondering about capacity around that really when planning.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Dale. Really nice to hear your comments about the work that we've done, in your local area. And long may that continue. We do loads of work with children and young people, much more than people realise actually. But in terms of your question, landscapes, cities, buildings, yes, we consider all new renovation programs. We consider emerging risks such as large-scale housing development, you know, things like Waverley that have come about in Rotherham. So if there's any large-scale development or infrastructure projects that the local authority has got in their infrastructure plans, then we will consider that. You'd be surprised that there's not necessarily a close link between, you know, a new emerging building development, specifically in terms of residential property, and an increase in risk, specifically because new builds tend to be built much safer. They all have hardwired smoke detection installed. The fire separation should, in theory, be much better than what it is. Obviously, we've had the complete tragedy, you know, back in June 17 with the Grenfell Tower fire. But that was a building that had been, dare I say, knocked about for many years, with retrospective works done on it in terms of installation of gas supplies and lots of renovation work that had been done by subcontractors and subcontractors of subcontractors. So the majority, when buildings are signed off by local building inspectors, there is a requirement that they've got to conform to something called Approved Document B, which is specifically in relation to fire risk of any new build. And what you tend to find is there's not a great deal of risk that emerges from new build. The other thing that we've got to consider is, like you said, when we're looking at landscape, we've got to consider new emerging infrastructure around road and rail network, which might create additional risks for ourselves. And if that creates a gap within our capability, so the Supertram being a good example, although it's been, the infrastructure has been there now many, many years, that would have created a bit of a headache for the chief fire officer and senior officers at the time, because there might not have been a capability to respond to an emergency involving Supertram. So that would have required us to then think about how we fill that gap. And just to give you some assurances, we do an operational foreseeable risk register every year. It's reviewed constantly. In fact, I was looking at the document today, and it captures all of the emergency incident types that as a service we may be required to attend. Some we will attend frequently, like building fires, others less so frequently, like water rescue scenarios or rescues from height. And then we assess our ability to respond to those incidents. So have we got a policy in place? Do we train our firefighters? Have we got relevant equipment? And if the answer is no, and we've got gaps, then we'll look at whether or not we need to invest to fill those gaps. So it gives you some assurances that whilst the document tries to cover that, we can't go into that much detail because it is a public facing document. And as Councillor McGowan says, we need to try to keep it relatively light read because it is a public document. So hopefully that answers your questions.
Okay. Councillor Tanger, do you want to answer your questions?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I'm struggling a little bit in terms of understanding how much of a change there's been in terms of South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue over the years. I mean, I've been on the council a long time, and what you see is a real increase in terms of the complexity of the kit that you've got available, and the very welcome increase in terms of preventative work. But I mean, I really wanted to follow up sort of Councillor Dale's points in terms of, I mean, Grenfell was such a tragedy. It's made us all worry about the whole steps of the process, whether that's planning, whether that's building regulations and fire and rescue itself. And for Grenfell to happen, it was a whole series of mistakes happened. So my understanding is, we've still got half a dozen buildings in Sheffield with ACM, and at the last partnership meeting we even had one of those where you and your colleagues hadn't signed off the safety certificate for that building. So it's I think so my questions are really sort of, how is that work carrying on? And the second point, really following from what Councillor Dale was saying, in terms of the new build, and those of us who sit on planning committee, every 3 weeks we seem to be agreeing a new tower block. Does that change your risk assessment? I accept the point that these are new high quality buildings, but does that change the way you deploy resources, and does it change the sort of extra specialist resources you need for tackling buildings up fire? And then a third question, totally unrelated, just going back to dark nights. I'm always surprised by the number of young people think throwing fireworks at each other is a fun use of their time. and the more we can do to prevent that happening, and to help educate them that they shouldn't be doing that in the first place, the better. I was disappointed this year, the number of fireworks that went on, the number of domestic displays, small domestic displays after bonfire night. So even 2 or 3 weeks later, we were still getting fireworks. And if there's a way of restricting the fireworks to just a few days a year, that would certainly help everybody who writes into council saying that we need to reduce the number of fireworks. So thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Sanger. So I'll try and pick up on all of those points. In terms of how the work's carrying on around our ability to inspect buildings for safety in the wake of Grenfell, clearly that had a massive shockwave across the fire sector. We want to make sure that not only our operational firefighters are aware of all of the high-rise residential buildings and any particular premises that is high risk. From a response perspective, we also have our dedicated fire protection staff who go and consider the building from a fire safety perspective. And those two parts of the organisation look at things through a different lens. If you think about fire safety, how do you get people out of a building quickly? And fire response is how do we get our firefighters into that building safely when it's on fire? It's quite a different thing to think about. So we've got to consider both of those things in terms of operational information to support firefighters when they do need to deploy to emergencies, and fire safety officers when they're advising building owners who ultimately have the responsibility in relation to their own risk assessment and the measures in place in their building for fire safety. In that regard, we have a limited amount of legal teeth, for want of a better phrase. If we could force building owners to remove that remaining cladding that exists across those buildings in South Yorkshire, Councillor Sanger, then we would have used that facility. The challenge that we have is if we've got remaining high-rise residential blocks and we force those blocks to effectively evacuate their residents through a forced prohibition notice, which we have within our power, we effectively make all those residents homeless. And we've got to consider that as part of the implications. And there may be what's classified as interim arrangements in place within those remaining blocks, such as waking watchers and other fire safety arrangements in place to try to ensure that the residents are quickly warned in case of fire. Because a lot of these traditional high-rise residential blocks in the UK were not designed for simultaneous mass evacuation. The staircases just are not big enough to accommodate it, especially when you've got to consider that those staircases are the same workplaces that firefighters deploy from to deal with any fire. And then you've got large numbers of residents evacuating at the same time. They were designed to contain a fire within a single occupant's flat. And the timescales that flat should be able to contain the fire with allow fire and rescue services to get to the incident, deploy firefighters to put the fire out where it originated from so it doesn't spread. Retrospectively or at point of design and build, I guess cladding and wrapping these buildings in flammable material from our perspective is craziness. But ultimately we are where we are in that regard, and we'll use whatever teeth that we can, from a legal perspective to try to force that issue and make these buildings safer. But we can only go so far. I think in terms of the specialist resources for certain incidents, again, that comes back to my previous point around our foreseeable risk register. We have something called a predetermined attendance. So the small fire in the open that I described earlier would receive a predetermined attendance of 1 fire engine because we only need 1 fire engine to deal with a small fire. The house fire with people trapped upstairs would result in a predetermined attendance of 3 fire engines, because we know that our models of deployment would require 3 fire engines worth of crews to safely deal with and hopefully get there quick enough to then recover or rescue the people, should I say, rescue, obviously. Where you've got high rise, we know that we need more resources, so we have a predetermined attendance of 6 fire engines and a dedicated aerial appliance. So depending on the type of incident that we know about, we've already determined how many fire engines we'll deploy. There's nothing then to stop the initial incident commander realizing that they need more resources, and all they need to do is put an immediate assistance call into our control centre and say, I need 10 fire engines at this job, and they are immediately dispatched by our control room. So there's always that capability as well. We do consider specialist equipment and appliances within our foreseeable risk register, and I've kind of covered that earlier. Your dark nights and fireworks, yes, they throw fireworks at each other. They also fire them at my staff now and again, which particularly annoys me. But we have to deal with that. And we were advocates of the Protect the Protectors bill that went through Parliament a couple of years ago, that were looking to speed up, you know, any litigation and prosecution of anybody found guilty of bringing any member of emergency services under attack, or you know.
Absolutely.
So we've seen some notable examples of that, but again, it's very challenging. We're working with vulnerable young people, and we'd rather see them enter diversion programs through Prince Trust to get them re-engaged with society, as opposed to necessarily giving them the tag of being a criminal. So it's challenging, Councillor Sanger. We you know, I absolutely abhor that kind of behaviour. But it exists, and we've got to work within communities to understand why it's occurring. And I'd prefer to go down that prevention and engagement route. But where we do see it happening, we will not hold back on any evidence that we've captured of individuals that are bringing our staff under attack, and we'll provide that evidence to the police to support prosecution.
Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. Yeah, Chris, thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. In terms of the plan, that's a framework for assessing risk. But I just wanted to ask if you can tell us what you think the significant new risks are that you've identified as a result of this. You know, what are the new issues there that you'll be looking at? And then, secondly, coupled with that, what are the significant new actions that you're looking to take as a result? So, just looking at what's new, really. But I just want to ask something else about the cladding issues as well. I represent the ward in the city centre, City Ward. So we've also got lots of private sector high-rise buildings there. I mean, we're told by the council leadership that there's still ongoing investigations, you know, partnership between the fire service and the council about looking to investigate and asking building owners about how safe their buildings are. But I mean, it's 3.5 years since Grenfell, and I think some people are probably alarmed that people are only now, you know, still asking the questions about the basics of, you know, what sort of cladding is on the building. So I just wonder if you can give us an update on where you are with that. And then the fourth thing rather, I just wanted to pick up on what you said now about there not being a great deal of risk that results from new builds. And again, I'm thinking of because of the amount of new building in the city centre. But of course, the point about Grenfell was that effectively it was new build that caused the fire. It was, although the building wasn't new, it was the external cladding that was the one that caused the fire to spread so rapidly around the whole of the building and engulf it and lead to that really, really awful tragedy. So in fact, it was the new build. That was only done in 2014 or so, 2013, 2014. It's the same cladding as on Hanover Tower in Sheffield, I know. And of course, you know, we're told that was signed off fully by the fire service at the time. And I think now the latest we heard is that there's 20 high-rise blocks in Sheffield, so presumably mostly in city centre, that got this ACM cladding that's potentially highly combustible. So I'm just wondering about you know, what's your take on how significant the risk is to that? Obviously, I appreciate the fact of a fire one of these that's going to take off like Grenfell is very low necessarily, but it's that risk that we're guarding against. So yeah, welcome your comments on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Johnson. Yeah?
Councillor Johnson, yes, that's right.
Thank you. In terms of our assessment of new and emerging risks, yeah, we're always keeping our eye on new and emerging risks. I suppose it's not new, but it is certainly emerging. Aging population is an emerging risk for ourselves.
Okay.
The correlation with people becoming much more vulnerable to fire if they are getting older in life. The example that I often share is the elderly gentleman that's been looked after by his wife all of his life, and unfortunately his wife passes, and he's never cooked before, he's never cleaned before, and all of a sudden he goes from being relatively low risk to very high risk very quickly. So they are emerging risks that we always need to consider, as well as the emerging risk around what's happened this year. There's an emerging risk around COVID, and it's limited our ability to cross the threshold of many vulnerable people, because whilst people are vulnerable to COVID, they're also vulnerable to fire because they fall into the same type of categories. So we've had to redesign our ability to provide education at distance, over the phone, using new methods such as this conversation that we're having tonight, to try to educate people in their home.
Does that impact on home safety checks then, or has it done significantly over this year?
Absolutely, yeah. We've been able to cross less thresholds this year because initially our firefighters were concerned that they might be asymptomatic, carrying the virus into the homes of people that we want to target from a fire safety message. And interestingly, we want to target people that are over the age of 65 and have specific vulnerabilities around their lifestyle. So if you ask somebody from a COVID risk assessment perspective, are they higher risk? And yes, they are. So that caused us some significant challenges, as you can imagine. But wherever we identified the highest risk, where there was no smoke alarms present, we would endeavour to still visit that property to fit smoke alarms. And even if it meant that the time that we spent in the property was much reduced, and the rest of education can be delivered from 2 or 3 meters down the garden path, then we'll still do that. So COVID-19 has caused us some issues in terms of that emerging risk. And I guess on a bigger, more strategic scale, environment, you know, the new environmental challenges we have around significant weather impacts. You know, the winter periods are getting much drier and hotter. We don't experience wildfires like they do in Australia and America locally, but the notable incidents that we do experience that challenge our resilience and the fact that we need to draw on other services support come from prolonged incidents that involve moorland fires, that involve the unsafe storage of refuse. We have a lot of recycling centres that are often way over their specified capacity of waste. Notably, there was an incident that was on the news recently in my previous service of West Yorkshire, and Bradford experienced an incident that required a good 2 weeks and is still ongoing from the Fire and Rescue Service to deal with tyres that were contained. And again, we have those types of premises in South Yorkshire, all emerging, because sometimes, Councillor Johnson, we don't even know about them. And it comes to our attention, and then we've got to develop our operational knowledge and where they are and how we would respond. So general environmental risks around flooding and wildfire are also those things that we need to make sure that we've got the capability to respond to. Ongoing investigations around buildings that might be unsafe. We do have the ability through the regulatory reform order, I think it's Article 27, where we can actually provide a letter to a responsible person asking them for their plans to remediate that building and make it safer. But we can't do much more than that. If we are so determined that the building is not safe for occupancy, we then issue either a prohibition notice or a restriction notice for the part of the building that's unsafe, until such time when that remediation work has been carried out. But I go back to my point, in terms of fire and rescue services, signing buildings off to be safe, that is not what we do. And we've not done that for a number of years. So the Fire and Rescue Service, after the cessation of something called the Fire Precautions Act, we used to issue fire certificates for buildings once they were deemed safe. The regulatory reform order removed all of that responsibility from fire. And again, in terms of the overall regulatory environment that perhaps resulted in Grenfell, where you know, subcontractors can work for subcontractors. And if you're really interested in that, I really advise you to listen to the BBC Sounds podcast on Grenfell, Radio 4, a 40-minute slot every day through both inquiries, and it's eye-watering listening. I'll say that. But the fire service is not responsible for signing buildings off as being safe. We're not even statutory consultees on a lot of renovation projects that might be passed by the local authority planning department. The only thing that we would get asked our opinion of is access for fire engines and local water supplies, to make sure that we can effectively gain access to that premises and provide an effective water supply in case that it was on fire. In terms of the design, the materials used, Fire and Rescue Services have got no say in any of that. That's all the regulatory environment that's wrapped up in in local building regulations, and the local building inspectors deal with all of that, or it's subcontracted to a private firm.
Thank you very much. That's very informative.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chris, for the presentation and the report. I've got a question on a specific part of the report, page 48 or page 14 of the original document. This page has got like several speech bubbles in with quotes, which I presume, correct me if they're wrong, but they're quotes from people who have taken part in the survey rather than observations from your officers or staff. Part of the on the Sheffield quote, it's got a comment on cycle lanes, and it reads, "Putting a measure in place is difficult as there may be traffic incidents, and that is difficult and unfair. They should have something built in for this. With cycle lanes in place, it makes it more difficult." Now, I don't quite understand what that's talking about, whether that's talking about like response times or something. I mean, have there been any incidents where cycle lanes or similar have caused delays to responses, and how does that compare to delays caused by general kind of motor traffic? I mean, in London they have quite large like cycle lanes that allow emergency services to bypass a lot of motor traffic, and is generally viewed as being helpful to improve response times. Does South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue kind of see that view? So I just wondered if you could kind of clarify that part of the report.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Shaw. I'm not 100% sure which document you're referring to there. If it's a speech bubble and it's in relation to, it sounds to me like that is a Sheffield resident that's fed back into our consultation, and we've just used it to capture some of the comments that we've received back. I'm surprised that we've probably used that as an example. It's not necessarily relevant to our overall risk modelling and risk planning approach or response times. To answer the question that you've posed, as a service, I think we would always encourage town and city planners to engage in green travel schemes. If that reduces the number of traffic, as in cars that are on the road, then obviously that has a positive impact on our response arrangements because there's less congestion. So we would always encourage the installation of traffic lanes. Our drivers, as I mentioned earlier, are very highly trained in blue light response driving, and they have a policy which is drive to arrive. So if they have to navigate certain cityscapes or streetscapes, which include everything from cycle lanes all the way up to smart motorway networks, their arrangement is that they will drive to arrive at the emergency as effectively as they can. They want to get there fast, but they want to get there, and ultimately the second one is more important than the first.
Oh, thank you. And yes, just if it would be possible to kind of clarify that, because on those speech bubbles, they don't seem to make clear whether it's a member of the public or whether it's endorsed in any way or curated in any way by the fire service. So maybe that could be clarified in the report.
Councillor Shaw, what is the document called? What does it say on the front page?
It's on the it's page 14 of the survey report, so the yellow document.
Yeah, when
it's talking about the survey results and things.
Yeah, it's the outcome of the initial public consultation survey. Yes. Yeah, that will certainly be, I can clarify that now. It'll be a comment from a member of the public surveyed from within one of the 4 districts, and if it's based in Sheffield response, it'll be one of the constituents in Sheffield.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Hogan.
Councillor John, thank you very much for your presentation. Very informative. Thank you very much. I was going to say, Councillor Johnson's already touched on climate change, where there's likely to be much more extreme weather events coming up, and you've sort of touched on it in page 14 of of the strategy. Do you feel that you've got the right level of equipment and the right support and the right, because, you know, we're talking about things that, you know, I've just been following. Last year there was fires on the Manchester and the moors above Manchester, and then this year there have been some, I'm not sure whether they were quite as severe as last year, but I think these have become more frequent. How big is the corporation for the Peak District itself? And do you think we've got the resources that we're likely to need with ever increasing extreme weather events? Because obviously, I'm not sure, is Fish Lakes, because I went down to Fish Lakes to the other side of Doncaster, because you had that with the flooding, and I know you said that's not a statutory responsibility, is it, potentially? So is there a likelihood that you could be pulled both ways with these sort of things which need to be dealt with, but then you've got the potential that your crews are under stress from dealing with the day-to-day stuff that you're dealing with in urban areas, and these are not seen as so important? And how are you matching that together? Because you only got a few paragraphs about the emerging threat on the environment here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think to reassure you around that skills gap or capability gap, one of the things that we did identify from the fire that we were dealing with at Hatfield was that we perhaps needed to just improve some of our ability within South Yorkshire to deal with large and protracted or long-standing moorland fires. As such, that's fallen onto one of our priorities for the next 12 months to improve the service's ability to deal with moorland firefighting. So within the document, in its final draft, we have 10 priorities that have been agreed within the service and will be finally endorsed by the Fire Authority in January. And priority number 9, as I read it now, is to review specific capabilities for dealing with wildfires and welfare during incidents. So that should hopefully, and we've already identified an investment plan of circa £100,000 to procure new equipment. So I have to go to Mr. Booth, cap in hand, and say, Stuart, I need a bit of money for an improvement scheme, and he has to find that money for me. So we have that in place to improve our wildfire capability, as well as the option for us to always lean into the support that we can get from our regional colleagues.
Yeah, please, darling.
Just one thing, the welfare, that is quite right, because one of the things I hadn't really picked up, but that you picked up on, is welfare of the firefighters, because these moorland fires are not just, you know, a couple of hours out, put out the fire and go back. It is long term, and it's making sure that in these remote locations that the firefighters are particularly looked after and their welfare is maintained over which could be a prolonged period of time. And I'm glad, I'm pleased to hear about that.
Yeah, Councillor Hogan, that's certainly in the plan. Just for information, Councillor Murphy, I think that your microphone's not on mute.
Have you been listening?
Thank you. So, Councillor Hogan, yes, welfare is one of our other priorities within the document. So you know that has landed in the final part of the report. We constantly review a lot of our specialist capabilities, but welfare and wildfire are 2 capabilities that we've identified as key priorities, and they've been included in our 10-point priority plan for this year's overall annual service priorities. So we will be investing in those 2 areas of work. You're quite right, we do have a rotation policy when we attend wildfire incidents. So invariably firefighters will be deployed for up to kind of 4 to 6 hours, and then they'll be rotated. But if you've got a 2-week long-standing incident like we had at Hatfield, it can become a challenge. Invariably, when firefighters are dealing with the wildfires at places like Hatfield, It's often a watching brief. They might be stood on a branch, just making sure an area doesn't get involved in fire. So we try to make sure that I suppose what the image that might be in your mind of firefighters trudging miles and miles and miles to beat fires out is not often the case after the first kind of 1 to 2 days. Don't get me wrong, it's quite challenging in the first stage, but once we've got our structure in place, a lot of the provision in terms of equipment and welfare and food and water is delivered across the incident ground using vehicles. So we do have, and again, those vehicles will be improved as part of that wildfire upgrade plan.
Thank you. Don't worry, Councillor Murphy, we won't tell everyone your deep, dark secrets.
I was just trying to think, what did I say? My husband was making my tea, so I might have thanked him for that.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead with your questions?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And thank you, Chris, for your presentation. I just want to start by echoing what some of my colleagues have already said, and thank you and your teams for all the work you do with our young people in our schools and in our communities. I think it's particularly important where there are incidents with young people, you know, and fireworks and bin fires, etc., like there have been in the manor recently. And I know the response that you guys had there was really a positive response with some of those young people. I also just want to ask about language in the risk management report. It's something that came up at the last scrutiny meeting when we were talking about our tower block at Hanover, where it was mentioned by one of the residents who was representing other tenants that a lot of the people who live in that block, English is a second language, and so a lot of work had to be done for people about ensuring that different languages were used to explain what was happening, and the fire procedures and the fire precaution measures in the meantime. Is that some work that is going on with yourselves under the fire risk management plan? And are you also working with partners around that? Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's always a challenge when you have people where English is not their first language, when you're trying to deal with education messages, specifically around something as important as how to evacuate a building safely, especially if it's high-rise residential. We do anticipate that a lot of that induction should be carried out by the building management and owners. You know, if there's a building management arrangement in place, then we'd expect residents to be provided with relevant information, hopefully in their home language, if not in pictorial form. Fire and rescue services have tried their best to consider how to turn some of their advice and education into different languages, and a lot of the work that we do online is available to put through Google Translate, and a lot of people who are non-English speaking use that facility on some of our web pages, and also some of our safety information leaflets are done in pictorial form, as well as just some very basic words that are generally in English, which has always been advised to ourselves through many of our, I guess, governance structures. National Fire Chiefs Council and the Home Office tend to put advice leaflets out in English and then use links to Google Translate or other ways to try to interpret that information. If we really struggle, then we've occasionally used the work of translators on our behalf, and our community safety teams have accessed translation services where they're working with occupants where the language barrier is too difficult to overcome. So we'll always try our best in that regards within the kind of limited resources that we've got. I hasten to add. I'm sorry, Councillor Murphy, has that covered your question? Because I know that you made more of a comment before around our work with CWAT, children and young people.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, that's all the councillors have had indicating to ask questions. So I just want to say thank you to Chris, to Stuart, and to Councillor Dams for coming along and joining us this evening. I just want to highlight a suggestion from Councillor Johnson in the chat function, which has been sort of commented on with others councillors supporting, which the suggestion about removing that cycling related quotation in the final draft and putting something more relevant and appropriate in its place for various reasons. So just wanted to highlight that to your attention. But otherwise, thank you for your time. So in terms of our ask on this item, it was to comment, which obviously they've heard what we've said. Was there anything in terms of specifics or recommendations anyone wanted to move at this point? Are we happy with the general flow of the discussion being noted and taken on board? I'm seeing nodding heads, so I'm assuming we're agreeing. Okay, that's grand. So we'll move on to the next item of the agenda. So Chris, Stuart and Tony, you're free to eat your tea or do something a little bit more exciting than sitting around chatting.
Well, if Anne's husband's got any time, he can come and do my tea, because I've got to go and do that now. But there you go.
I'll ask him for you, Tony. It's on its way.
Cheers.
It's funny you say that. My house is in between on the way to Tony, so he can drop me some in too.
Well, thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. It's really nice to meet you all. And thanks, Jay, for setting up the meeting and inviting us. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Yeah, bye-bye. Good night.
Right, so now we've got the work programme, which there's not a huge amount to update from the discussion last time. Sorry, it's not new or persistent. It's 3 weeks old and 2 tests have come back negative. So I don't know what it is, but it's presumably not that. So we have flagged the issues that we discussed last time as priority. I guess one of the main developments would be that at the overview Scrutiny Management Committee, we discussed a youth services review and sort of expressed that people on this committee would want to be part of that and not just leave it to young people, given the work that we've done around gun and knife crime previously and the level of knowledge and expertise of councillors on it. So there'll be something going around about that in the not too distant future, and hopefully we'll get good involvement from our committee on that. Deborah, is there anything you want to add on that for now?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think that's obviously you're exactly right. I've updated it with regards to the priorities that were expressed at the last meeting. I'm also going to try and schedule in, obviously, at least one look at the community safety partnerships work this year, because that's a statutory requirement. So you'll note that we've got 4 items that are priority and 3 meetings, so that's going to be interesting. I'll try and double up for one of the meetings, but obviously I recognise that we're consistently running with just 1 item at the moment, and it is still taking up the full meeting. So I'll see what I can do to play about with that. And the final point that you've just raised there about the children in the youth services thing. I had a discussion with some of the my colleagues within the scrutiny team, and we're aware that there is an item due to come to the Children and Young People's Committee around youth services later this year. I think it's February. And so I think the suggestion is that we might want to wait until that item's considered in February, because they have been exploring that item in quite a lot of detail themselves before we make a decision on, or before members make a decision on any further work that would need to be done on that, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. So I've got 2 questions indicated. Councillor Huggin, do you want to fire away?
It was about the community safety partnership. It's because obviously it's a statutory duty, and I thought we're supposed to do it on an annual basis. So that needs to be right up there, because I think Councillor Paul Wood did say that there's a review going on, so we need to get him in to say, ask about that. about the future working of the partnership. So that's something we need to have as a priority, I think. You know, a priority, higher priority.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Agree completely with that. I think it's first on the list of the items to be scheduled. So we'll make sure that that's there. Councillor Sanger, do you want to make your comment?
I mean, just to follow up, I was going to raise the same point. I mean, Councillor Wood said he was going to review it. Surely, if you're going to review it, you might as well use the scrutiny committee as part of that review. I mean, clearly there is an issue that it's become much more operational than it should be as a partnership and not strategic enough. And we've had a bit of a rolling cast of police officers rather than having, you know, the same people feeding into partnership meetings, which you generally get better work at any committee or partnership if you've got the same faces for a period of time. So I do think it needs a good look at.
Yeah, acknowledged and agreed. Absolutely. Right, I've not had anyone else ask to raise a question, so I guess if we draw that item to a close, and obviously our next meeting's on the 7th of January, so it feels way too early to say this. It's gone by so quickly, but I wish you all a Merry Christmas and have a great New Year.
Merry Christmas, Chair.
Merry Christmas, Chair.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everybody else. I think it was
Merry Christmas, happy
Merry
holidays,
Christmas.
everybody.
Enjoy, everyone.
Happy
Yeah.
Hanukkah.
Yeah, first day of Hanukkah today.
Happy Hanukkah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very inclusive. Well done, Andy.